Today, right now, we have with us Jimo Sorodio and Becca Vigil, and they're going to be talking about human problems require diverse human solutions. So there are many pressing social challenges in the world and many theories about what paradigm shifts of the collective human experience are required to resolve them. What if, however, we zoomed into each community of humans to marvel at the fabric of interconnections that connect different groups and the ingenuity already at work to define, address, and solve pressing local challenges? This talk will explore the metaphor that human creativity and innovation is emerging in global contexts in a similar way that other species fit into their unique ecosystems. In a chaotic world defined by the climate crisis, the sensations of harmony and stability that come from rich, diverse ecosystems is an ambition many are innovating to regain. With an anthropological and biological lens, we'll explore how our interconnectedness and diversity lead to creative solutions to complex problems. You guys, take it away.
Hi, Becca.
Hi, Jamo. Hi, Wendy. Thank you
Hi.
so much for the introduction. So for this hour, I'm Becca. Very nice to meet you all and to be here. I'm super, super happy to be participating in this conference. And as far as kind of a flow for the hour, I'm going to do a quick presentation about anthropology and creativity, just to share some key topics and some key themes. And then Jimo is actually going to do an interview with me and ask me some questions so that we can just have a conversation about why an anthropological lens to creativity and to complex social problems is a really exciting potential and a really exciting toolkit that I would love to share with more folks.
Awesome.
I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. Great. So I am studying to be an applied anthropologist. And honestly, when I started that application process, I didn't even know what that meant. But what I did know about myself was I am really compelled by the big social problems that we are seeing in the world. And probably for each of you, a different example popped into your mind. Jamo and I had the pleasure of working together on Just Learn. I was on his team in the really early days. And he kind of opened my mind into how invention and creativity can be addressing these big complex issues, but sometimes they start as little nuggets of ideas and kind of fringe potentials for how we can rethink about the way that humanity works and the way that society works. So what I have kind of taken that experience and morphed it into is wanting to understand what creativity and what invention and what innovation is as a social phenomenon, and really looking at it from an anthropology standpoint, so how that relates to culture. So anthropology is the study of culture, like I just mentioned, and the structures that organize human societies. And applied anthropology is a new form of anthropology that I am specializing in. And what it does is it's taking anthropological insights and putting it into action. And I'll give some examples later about exactly what that looks like. But really, it's taking research and knowledge and what we know about how the world works, and we're continuing to develop that knowledge base as a discipline. And then there's some of us that are really interested in putting that knowledge to work. How can we help communities solve their own problems? How can we understand why social inequalities are structurally built into our systems? Why are these things happening, and what can be done to change it? And in a lot of cases, amazing work is already being done to change it. And all of you are a testament to that. So that's a big part of, the context of this conversation as well. So to give a little bit of history, anthropology and anthropologists like myself are doing a lot of work to kind of redefine what the public understands anthropology to be. And in the earliest 20th century, it had some really problematic origins. It was involved with honestly creating the theoretical underpinning of racism. and doing a lot of really questionable work during World War II in various communities to help different sides win that war. And where we've reflected the discipline and where we're taking it now is that the core idea of being curious about other cultures is really sound. What we do with that information and how we approach the relationships that we have with different people and different cultures is really where there's an opportunity for us to kind of change the script and change our approach. So on the left-hand side is Margaret Mead, probably one of the most famous anthropologists from the 20th century, and a fantastic feminist theorist as well about what it means to be a young woman in Papua New Guinea, and that idea and those insights that she actually brought into America at the time. This is in about the 1930s through the 1960s. And she did a lot to help kind of reframe what it means to be a young woman in America and what kind of implications that has on society and for an individual identity. Now, moving to Lila June Johnson on the right-hand side is one of my favorite current anthropologists. She is really multimodal, as you can see: poet, musician, educator, anthropologist, activist, and community servant. Most recently, I actually heard about her because she was running for state legislature in New Mexico. And she identifies as a Diné woman from the Navajo Nation and is changing what an anthropologist looks like. She is from a Native American community. She is rooted in the culture and history of New Mexico and is taking what she knows about all of the challenges and also the beauty of indigenous knowledge and trying to bring it into the New Mexico state legislature. And that's an example of, really bringing that into action. So what we're going to be talking about today, like one of the key things that we're talking about is embracing difference. And this is probably not an unfamiliar idea to a lot of you creatives out there, because in a lot of ways, creatives and inventors and innovators are defined as kind of the misfits in society, and your ideas or your creations are not always really readily accepted by the mainstream. And we're all here to celebrate that. It's a lot of creatives in one place, and so we feel more at home and like we're with like-minded people, right? So this is kind of reinforcing that it's really valuable as like a cognitive toolkit for more people to embrace difference and to really learn how to hold space and embrace that as a way to open more possibility and more perspectives for what life on Earth is like right now and how we might change it to make it more equitable and just for many more people. So, like the introduction mentioned, we're drawing some connection between cultural difference and biological difference. So, in these two cases, it seems kind of obvious that what a zebra has evolved to become is specific to its environment and specific to its ecosystem, as compared to what an Icelandic pony has needed to evolve to be able to survive and to thrive in its own kind of extreme environment. And as the world around these two creatures changes, the way that they will be changing biologically, obviously, they don't have quite as much navigability, if you will, as we humans perceive ourselves to for pressing challenges. They will have different conditions that influence how they evolve and how they change and how they become more fit to be in their environment. So we're taking a similar, like, broad stroke connection to cultural difference in unique cultural contexts. I'm not here to make the case that communities and cultures evolve in the same way that biological evolution works. So really it's just to kind of paint the picture that what works for a zebra is what is different than works for an Icelandic pony, in the same way that what works for me as a woman in America is very different than what might work for a woman in Guatemala right now. So some of the key topics, things that I have talked about and will keep coming back to, really, really core pieces of how anthropology and applied anthropology can contribute to the amazing creative work of everybody here. We're talking about social issues, lots of different kinds at lots of different scales. We're talking about creative individuals within a community, and then also collective creativity when a lot of people come together to come up with new ideas and new concepts. It's important for us to define what community is in order to understand what issues that community is experiencing or how they want to solve their problems. We're talking about cultural diversity, and we're talking about understanding context. So, in addition to who's your community, what is the way that the world works around that community that is influencing their lived experience? So, I want to do a really quick kind of breakdown of a question so that in the conversation that Shimo and I have, we're going to talk about a lot of different applications for anthropology and how communities are solving their own problems. So in the breakdown of a seemingly simple question, how can we help women suffering from oppression? Seemingly simple is actually an incredibly complex question. So first of all, who are the women that we're referring to in this question, and where are they in the world? And this gets back to who's the community and what is their context. And in a really important paradigm kind of shifting question next is, do the women themselves define their state of living as suffering? Or is that something that a Western thought is kind of imposing onto the situation? If they do identify that way, how do they articulate what oppression looks like? Is it economic oppression? Is it emotional oppression? How is this actually manifesting in the experience of these women? And then when it comes to helping them, what does it mean by help? What do they need? What could a project look like? What could influence or a foreigner like myself? What would an intervention look like as defined by that community? And then if we came up with a really cool project and we helped the lives of many women in this community, could that same project work for a group of women in Guatemala as it does as a group of women in Egypt? Maybe, and also maybe not. And then finally, thinking about the time element and kind of the patience and perseverance that it takes to see change happen in a community. How long will it take to move from suffering to liberation? So, really dissecting when we ask these big questions about how the world is working and if we want to change it, it's so important to really understand exactly what we're asking, who we're asking about, and what kinds of things we can experiment with, if you will, to try to make that situation different or better. So a little bit about me. Why am I kind of the one here talking about this? Like I mentioned, I'm studying to be an applied anthropologist because I really believe that the skill set that we have can be beneficial to humanity right now. I am a former edtech startup COO, a job that I never imagined having, and a creative individual, Jimo, offered that to me and kind of opened up a whole world of possibility and exposed me to how business works. I'm a native New Mexican. I was born and raised in Albuquerque, New Mexico, at the crossroads of many different cultural groups and cultural communities. I'm a biracial woman. I'm a holistic thinker, which is also really beneficial for anthropologists. We like to take into consideration lots of different perspectives and think about whole systems and how all of those things are influencing and interacting with each other. I'm an ethical leader, which is another whole nother presentation about how we define ethical and what that means culturally. And I'm an environmental advocate, which is another intersection with the incredible work that Jimo is doing to bring this new technology to young people and expose them to the environment right inside the classroom. So as I wrap this up, I want to give an example that I find just really, really amazing. And it's connected to New Mexico, it's connected to anthropology, and it's connected to creativity. The picture that you see here is a woman named Helen Cordero, and she was a Cochiti Native American woman creating ceramics in the mid 20th century, in about the 1960s. And she came up with a completely new form of ceramics in her community. And a seemingly small change to the way that a ceramic figure is created had amazing and a diverse range of implications after it was created, and it gained a tremendous amount of popularity. So, this example specifically, when we ask, how do we alleviate the oppression of women? It might not have been any of my ideas that if we just changed the way that we created a figurine and allowed more women in the community to create this piece of pottery and to sell it on the international market, that probably wouldn't have been my idea. But it was Helen's idea that if she came up with something that meant a lot to her, in this case, on the right hand side, it's a storyteller figurine and it's modeled after her grandfather. And it was completely new. Nobody had ever done it before. And that invention and that disruption in a long history and tradition of Cochiti ceramics has alleviated poverty for hundreds of women in her community. Every Pueblo community in New Mexico now has a version of the storyteller, and they're still incredibly popular with art collectors and with tourists. And interestingly, there's been a lot of social implications of more women artists having the intellectual property, if you will, of this new invention, and how that has influenced their lives and influenced the political dynamics of their local communities. So that's just one example. I can go into more detail. Jimo's going to ask me lots of different questions, but I wanted to just kind of set the stage for what is anthropology, why does it matter when we're talking about creativity, and how can all of these different concepts come together to kind of be a part of our current conversation about making the world a better place.
Awesome. And we already have some comments. I'm going to wait a second to kind of address them. But I just wanted to say, Becca, for the last 6-7 years that I've known you, I have just incredible respect for your mindset and your view of the world. And so can we explore a little bit more of your journey into anthropology? I certainly recognize a lot of your values and principles with a huge focus on the environmental crisis and sort of the solutions. But what is your personal journey into anthropology?
Yeah, definitely. So I think the journey started in undergrad for me. So this was like around 2012, 2013. And I moved from Albuquerque to Tampa, Florida. First time I had ever left the house that I was, born and raised in. So in a lot of ways, that was my first experience with quote unquote culture shock, going into a completely different environment and kind of navigating and negotiating who I was and who I wanted to be, and meeting lots of new people, and you were one of them. So when I was in undergrad, I was studying environmental science, and I absolutely loved how big the scope of environmental science was. Like, you're literally thinking at a global scale, but then you can also zoom in and think about a river and just the river ecosystem, and that, like, zooming in and zooming out of different issues or different ecosystems was really intriguing to me. So I wanted to kind of keep working with that. So that was one piece of my mental framework that I started to develop in undergrad. And then I had the opportunity to go on a number of service trips through a volunteer organization on campus. And the first one that I went on was to Peru. And we spent a lot of time in the Sacred Valley focusing on women's education and access to education and food security. And that was the first time that somebody had conceptualized a social issue for me and kind of wrapped it up into this big theme of women's empowerment or food insecurity. And then when we were on the ground going to different communities and really understanding what that looked like, food, like what is food security, was really specific to that region. And there were lots of different influences. So I subsequently was completely in love with this idea of getting to know other people and being more of a global citizen that I had ever been encouraged to be growing up, and continued to go on trips, to continue to kind of reflect on my privilege and my now sense of responsibility to use my privilege and my resources to support folks that were born into contexts that don't have that kind of access. And so all of that kind of wrapped up with undergrad of these major social issues exist. We haven't really solved them, especially not on like a big scale. And I think there are examples of us globally making tremendous progress to alleviate suffering of millions of people. And then that was what kind of got me into your world with innovation and technology and education. So that was really an actual case study that I could participate in. That how do we change the world if we want more access to environmental education? Okay, hypothesis. What if we created a tiny desktop ecosystem that multiple could live in a classroom? What would that be like? So you and I, shared that story for a few years and tried to make that work. So I learned about business in that one. I learned about, relationships of money and how money influences progress, which is a key thing that I'm kind of honing in on now with my research. And then my identity as a woman in the startup space also influenced a lot of my commitment to feminism and understanding feminism on a much deeper level and trying to bake in to an actual business. How do you bake in more progressive or equitable or feminist practices at the foundation so that when it gets bigger, everybody can share in that prosperity over time?
Great. Yeah, definitely. So I want to explore sort of the theme of this talk a little bit more in creativity, but let's wait a second on that one. I wanted to maybe first ask, as I'm not a scientist, but I'm just, I follow science very deeply, especially in the context of environmental progress. But something that's definitely very popular and trending is, the term citizen scientist. This is something that is encouraged, to students, just kind of a responsibility that each of us, picks up early on and kind of commits to leaving the world a better place through science. It sounds like there's room for citizen anthropologists as well, and perhaps we certainly don't have enough of these experts, and perhaps with applied anthropology. What are your thoughts on that? Are we, is this continuously being adopted by society, and will it play a role in making the world a better place?
Yeah, that's a super good question. And I think a great connection to draw between what is the difference between an expert and a very curious and committed citizen, and how can each have a different impact or beneficial impact on their community. So I definitely think that there's an opportunity for citizen anthropologists, and I think that they're already everywhere. So I think that it's already in folks that are diplomats that are working for the UN. I think that it's in people who are working in politics in various different ways. I think so that it's people that are already working in their community, whether they're leading nonprofit organizations or doing grassroots organizing to amplify the voices of folks that need different resources or different societal attention. So in that sense, apply like the applied part, there are so many people really like tinkering and fundamentally rethinking the way that the world works, that is happening, and it's a really exciting kind of energy and effort. Activists, advocates, right, those are some of those other words for it. What uniquely brings an anthropologist into the fold of that is, like I was mentioning, that holistic perspective. And I think that there is definitely an opportunity for more folks to sit at the table with multiple stakeholders and really hold the space and hold the possibility of having everybody's needs at the table met. And sometimes with an activist in a local government, that can be a really contentious situation. The activist is not always, sitting being wildly compassionate to the government, because sometimes, and this is a generalization, but sometimes in that frame, it's I need something from you, you're unwilling to give it, because of your ideologies, that sort of thing. And same thing from the other perspective. So, what's really, really powerful about the anthropological approach is that holistic, we're taking lots of different opinions and perspectives. Sometimes we're helping dissimilar stakeholders understand each other and really bridge the gap between their connection and their needs and wants. So, in that sense, I think a lot of it's already happening. And also, there is definitely opportunity for more folks in the community to help hold people together to make these really incredible projects that can actually address problems, because that's super hard to do.
Mhm. Yeah, and coming back to creativity, I mean, and to speak about anthropology, I mean, there's the internet and just how technology has shaped us in the last decade is really at a fast pace, and I can think of both negative and positive. I mean, on one end, today we're talking about echo chambers and just amplification of disinformation in some cases. And I myself sometimes I just don't know what's true anymore. But on the other hand, I think the voice of a lot more people now are lifted beyond your mainstream media and beyond the agenda imposed on you. You know, whether it's 4-hour podcasts that just hone in on a topic in a very honest and conversational way, or even just trends with investment, with retail investors actually dominating certain investment strategies. So, do you think anthropology will also, without being labeled an expert, which you made a differentiation, do you think that there's a sense of responsibility on us to kind of lift, sort of make these problems more visible, or and kind of inspire others? And what's the role of individuals to kind of you know, follow this direction, aside from reading, you know, a great book on anthropology, and I can name a few.
Yeah. Yeah, no, that's definitely a great question. As far as the individual responsibility, we all have a different role to play. And I definitely think it's really important that each of us continue to explore our talents and offerings to society and maximize them as much as possible. So, not everybody is really interested or, fit in a sense to go into a community completely unlike their own and perhaps commit a decade to understanding what's going on in that community, what could be better, how can they make it better, and trying to do everything that they can to participate in that. I think lots of folks are doing that in our own community, and democracy is an example of this process that I'm kind of talking about, of like bottom up creativity and influence, and how that ultimately ladders up into a collective reimagining of how the world works. And I think there's many social issues on the table that have proven that. The women's rights movement is an excellent example. At one point, even just 100 years ago, this was a fringe idea at the fringe of society, that women should be full citizens and full participants in the democratic process. And within 100 years, it moved from the fringes into the core of how society works, and now is something that we kind of live with. So there's so many other really important ideas at the fringe of society moving in at various levels. And it's a hard thing to kind of conceptualize, but like in my mind, it's definitely like a network and nodes. So you can think of something as big as America, and what are the fringe ideas, and are they moving in? But then you can even think somewhere like where we live in Tampa Bay, what are the fringe ideas in Tampa Bay that are, starting to gain more momentum, more mainstream accessibility? And one of them, I would say, is climate change. For a long time, the work that I did in Tampa Bay was focused on amplifying the imminent threat of climate change to Tampa Bay. We're such we're a coastal city. We're surrounded by water, many different kinds of water. And nobody was talking about it. And there's lots of different reasons for that. But that was a fringe idea, that we should have climate policy and that we should be building our buildings in a particular way. And we're one of the top 5 fastest growing cities in the country. So all of these different tensions of like, how is Tampa currently working? And then a lot of, different ideas about how, if we wanted to have a longer term mentality about the viability of Tampa for all of the different communities involved, what would that take? And those ideas are still kind of on the fringe.
Yeah, no, for sure. This is really cool. You're reminding me of sort of the movement, not movement, but the transition really into a knowledge-based economy, right? Which kind of is the framework that a lot of not just circular economics is really being built on, but even countries that are, for example, oil-based economies, they're really um, they now have a sense of urgency to kind of transition society. And it sounds like anthropology has an incredible role to play, not just in preserving culture, but in expanding consciousness, really. Is there a state of mind or a condition in which culturally sort of to go on the theme of this, but where creativity and problem solving can really accelerate and drive community action?
Yeah, that is such a good question. Collaboration is the number one thing that comes to mind, and patience, which is one of my least favorite words, but increasingly I'm seeing is really, really critical. So, what we see in different anthropology projects that are happening all over the world, but some of them in the States that I've been particularly interested in. One example that was happening in Akron, Ohio. It was an anthropologist, an applied anthropologist named Carolyn Berman, and she was a researcher at a local university and collaborated with a local elementary school to understand food insecurity. And what was interesting about her really organic and like emergent approach of working with this elementary school was that she didn't go in and say, hey, we want to study food insecurity. She went with her students just to understand the food culture generally. And she really picked up on an interesting comment from one of the lunch ladies one day. And the lunch lady said, I noticed that my kids eat more food at the end of the month. So to the applied anthropologist, this is a really curious hypothesis. And they found over 2 years of community research, they connected the 5th grade science students with the college students to literally weigh the trash cans at different points of the month and see if this hypothesis was true. And it was true that the kids were eating more food and that there was less food waste at the end of the month. And then the anthropologist in her said, well, why is that? Why are they eating more and why is there less waste? And they were able to draw a connection to the dollars of government support for food security. So any of your like WIC programs and government assistance for food tended to run out towards the end of the month, and kids felt the pressure from at home, from there being a lack of food, to take it home and to help their siblings and that sort of thing. And out of that, actually, multiple projects, multiple years came out. They ended up starting a food pantry there that was run by some of the teachers and had really an unlimited access to food for the students there. From that evolution, they were able to say, what is the quality of the food that we're making accessible to our children? How can we improve that? So it just created this continuing thought process and engagement with her community. And the piece that I read ended up being a decade worth of engagement, participation, and collaboration with this group. And specifically, her unique offering to that community was bringing a lunch lady to the table, 10 fifth graders to the table, the principal, the community food pantry organizer, a few parents, right? A really eclectic group of folks that takes a lot of energy to manage and kind of convince and to listen to their unique perspectives, because the lunch lady didn't come out and say, we have a food insecurity problem and this is my idea. She's just like, it was this observation, like, this is super curious, like, why is this happening, and like, can we get them more food? And it just turned into a very long, fruitful engagement with the community. But it wasn't her idea and it wasn't her design necessarily. She was helping the community come up with different ideas and different approaches to solve that for themselves and for them to benefit from all the effort that they put into it.
Yeah, for sure. So actually, this kind of brings up the comment Douglas made around really having to think very deeply about all stakeholders. And the case in point, the example here was the installation of a well in a particular village, I presume, where surely adding a well and water was great, but it failed to understand the habits and the disciplines and the routines in place. And to quote, these women actually benefited from getting from escaping from their kids and their husbands for a few hours. So I guess the opportunity cost there wasn't worth it. But to follow up with Holly, she's talking about she asked around the importance of being curious of and embracing different cultures. And I really have to go back to ecology here, because to me, at least, that's the lens I see things, and the one that makes most sense. I mean, it's very simple concept where the more biodiversity you have in an ecosystem, the more tolerant and resistant, and the more sophisticated its carrying capacity becomes, so it can actually house more. And so this concept from cultural values and just insight from as many walks of life, it seems like there's quite a bit of a difference between inclusion because of underrepresentation versus inclusion because collectively we can generally just benefit. So what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, that is definitely kind of the crux and a lot of the rub of some of the diversity and inclusion conversations happening. I think it's a little problematic that in some cases we're associating diversity with productivity. And to Holly's question, are we getting more curious? I think that we are. And I would like to encourage everyone to let that curiosity not have an end goal or have an end motive. That it is really important that we are curious for the sake of curiosity, not necessarily for finding a way to use that person, that culture, that identity to achieve a certain end, right? Like, I think innovation and creativity are emergent properties and emergence of just having communities of people who really trust each other, right? And that's something that we talk a lot about as anthropologists, especially usually being a non-native person going into different communities. Our ability to build relationships and build trust with different people is really critical to them actually feeling comfortable to be themselves around us, right? So I think, to Holly's point, what can we be doing? I think just relax a little bit almost in some of those interactions, and just be curious, ask people questions without a specific end goal. Especially, I think, with race being such a really painful topic in America right now, we don't need to always talk about that with people of different races, right? Like, we can be like, where's your favorite place to eat in town? Okay, cool. Like, focus on building relationships, focus on building friendships, focus on finding genuine interest and care in the experience of that person, as opposed to kind of getting their perspectives on issues that might not actually build trust, but might, like, especially initially, right? They're hard conversations to have, and there's so much history and context and education sometimes it's required that I've had a lot of success just, totally new human, new stranger, no idea where they've been or where they're going. I think releasing judgment is a big part of that, and a really challenging approach to approach a situation and be really aware of your own biases. So I think those are some of the themes that I would kind of pick up from that. Is let's just be curious about each other, and that'll take time. We can't immediately become, best friends with the new person at the office that is of a really different identity, you know, that just, you know, get to know them, like be friendly, grab lunch a few times or virtual coffee dates and stuff, and not necessarily focus on like, okay, great, so you're from this other country, well, what do you think? How can we use that, right? Like ideally that'll come eventually, but if they feel comfortable, they'll just offer that perspective without being prompted like, hey, you're different, weigh in. It's like, okay, just give everybody a little bit of time to kind of settle in, and then they'll feel comfortable to share their opinions, and you'll know that it's different in a lot of cases just because of where they come from and who they are.
Definitely, definitely. One of the things I feel really grateful for was my upbringing. I mean, it was very international. I went to an international school, multiple international schools, and now I'm, selling a product to the American school systems that are very different from the school systems that I went to. When I was in seventh grade or high school. Um, do you feel that the world is becoming more international? I'm an immigrant, for example. So I have a couple of perspectives in this, but are you hopeful? Are you optimistic about society merging with itself in a more holistic manner, or are things still kind of do you anticipate them being siloed, and are some of the threats now emerging with the internet, do you think they will persist, or what are your thoughts on the future?
Yeah, huge question with lots of different parts. What what I'm kind of comfortable speaking to on that one is partially influenced by the work of an archaeologist that I was reading that made a great piece. I'll share it in the chat once we wrap up. But it's a short book about the 5 major trends in human existence as he sees it. And it was the point of the book was a retrospective of where we've been to see if there's anything that we could predictively expect for the future. And his hypothesis is that increasingly as a society, a global society, we are moving towards global citizenship and like a global unification of really embracing the reality that biologically we are all the same. All of the Homo sapiens are like the other Homo sapiens. And what distinguishes us is the culture and the context that we live in and the environments that we live in. But that doesn't have to be threatening. It can be generative. And there's a massive wrestling with that right now of those ideologies and those perspectives on the global stage. I think for me personally, I really embrace that idea of global citizenship and am open to all of the nuances that that has. I think there's that competing tension between globalization and then like the hyper local identity creation also. And I do believe and kind of subscribe to this myself, that we should be acting locally and looking to make a positive impact in our immediate community, and also feeling compassionate and a cultural relativity to those in very dissimilar contexts. So I feel a global citizenship with women all over the world. And I know that that's not a monolith. The global woman is very different and has in lots of different situations. And as a woman, I feel a responsibility to understand better what other women are experiencing and how they what their worldview is for a better world, a more just world, a more livable future, planetary wise, like environmentally wise. So it's that zoom in, zoom out that I was mentioning at the beginning, right? So big picture, I think the idea of global citizenship would unite all of us. Zoom in, individual identity matters and the different contexts that we live in and the way that we've decided to structure society with laws is different. And it's important that we hold a space for that difference as well.
Mhm. All right. Well, I think we're ending soon here, but I do have one last question.
Okay.
What is your advice to me and to the rest of the world, really, on how to confront minorities and underrepresented groups, and in some cases, whether it's women or other archetypes. What is your no BS, completely honest advice?
Yeah. Go out of your way to put yourself in uncomfortable cultural situations, and do it for the sake of not extracting the cultural information in those different places, but to educate yourself. And an example I could give, just this weekend, my partner and I traveled to Houston, and we're mostly vegetarian, vegan diets. And we found this great place, and it happened to be at a Hare Krishna temple. And it was the most outstanding vegetarian food for anybody who's in Houston, going to Houston. And we just showed up with completely open hearts and open minds to what they were offering. And the point of them having a restaurant was to invite the community in a different way, and for them to bring different types of people to their doorstep so that they could share. And, instead of just eating and getting excited and taking photos, because we were in a different cultural context, I knew nothing about, I just show up at this temple in the middle of Houston, like, whoa, where, where have I taken us? We talked to a lot of the folks that were working there, just like, hey, can you, tell us about this place? What is the history of this place? Like, who are you? And, what does it mean to you to be here and to be in service? And this is your, spiritual practice. And it was just fascinating. Just to talk to them, and they were really grateful that we entertained a conversation, and we're genuinely curious about who they were and what they were up to. And then you also got to experience a delicious meal. So in that sense, go to new places, go to different places, and if it's comfortable, and read the room, obviously, but if it is like a safe and a culturally welcoming place, just ask people, get to know them a little bit. And that's the ethnographer in me, that's the anthropologist. Just everything is an interview, and really the whole point is just to get to know as much as you can about the other person and what they're enjoying during our short time here on planet Earth.
Great. So travel places, meet new people, and try new food. Thanks,
Yep.
Becca, for sharing your wisdom with us.
Absolutely. Thank you for asking such wonderful questions.
Of course. Thanks.
Thank you guys
Hey,
so
Wendy.
much. Hey, I was so, that was so interesting. And actually, I thank you, Jimmo, for asking that last question, which was similar to what I had actually asked in chat, because I think that, Becca, the skill to talk to people is something that I've heard or understood, especially with the younger generations, that people are, they're losing that skill. I don't know that people like my age, we're used to talking to people. I don't know that my kids would feel comfortable walking into a place and just saying, wow, tell me about what you do here. Yeah. So I was to say,
that's a really good point. That's a really good point. And I mean, even I'm kind of a nerd in workplaces about intergenerational collaboration. Like, how can we get the boomer and the, Gen Z to like relate to each other on a project to varying levels of success? That's a pretty experimental one in most workplaces. And, that one has so much to do with the back to Jimmo's point, like the technology and how information influences the way that we see the world. And yeah, so that's a really interesting point as far as like direct, in person, when we can get back to that experiences with folks. I will say that there's a phenomenal proliferation happening on social media of younger folks really embracing some of these marginalized identities and creating content to educate others about it. And some of the examples that I'm following and learning a lot from are women of Indigenous descent that are really committing the time and the energy into learning traditional singing, as an example, or traditional costume design, traditional dance. And they're falling in love with these cultural traditions and these cultural artifacts and sharing it with the world, and kind of explaining what they're learning from it. So even though that's not, necessarily I'm not directly engaging with that person, but they are, showing up on the world stage saying, this is my identity. These are the things that I love. This is worth protecting. This is worth investing in. And I'm sure that they have a lot of really polar reactions to the content that they're making. But for the sake of this audience and from, I think, where a lot of us are coming from, there's a lot of beautiful creators and artists and educators on the internet right now that are 17 years old and teaching me more about being New Mexican than I even really know, right? So how you get access to that information is definitely different for each generation.
Absolutely. And I think that the world is changing so rapidly, especially with the COVID, and we've all learned how to become virtual learners and virtual members of society. And that will shape our future in a different way than it has before.
Absolutely. Yeah. Well, thank you so much for having me here. And, to everybody watching, I don't necessarily see myself as one of the most creative people in the room, but I am in service to many of you, as somebody who wants you at the table, will advocate to have you at the table, wants to bring your ideas to the right investors, to the right people, to the right, power structures. And I think those are changing. But that's kind of my role. And I hope that this was an interesting way to see how we can continue building trust with dissimilar people in order to make really good work more common in the world.
It's a very valuable lesson and a very important message. Thank you both so much. Jimmo, thank you so much for chatting with Becca, and you guys continue on and do amazing work. And I can't wait to see you again in the future and talk more about this.
Thank you,
Thank
Wendy.
you guys. Thanks. Yep.
Thank you.
Thank you
Bye-bye.
so much. Bye-bye.